Good afternoon, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center's panel discussion, Investing in Broadband to Narrow the Digital Divide. It's my pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tom Romanoff. I'm the Director of the Technology Project here at BBC. Today, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to discuss how investing in broadband access will narrow the digital divide for all Americans. This is a timely discussion, as there are a number of bills, including the recent bipartisan infrastructure bill, which includes broadband. Today, we'll focus our conversation on three areas, including rural and urban broadband build-out and access, broadband ownership models and government investments in municipal networks, and defining a new standard for high-speed internet and to meet the needs of the modern digital economy. For our participants listening, we encourage you to submit your questions by tweeting us at BBC Live or using the live chat function on YouTube and Facebook. These questions will be held to the end, and we will make as much time as we can to get to as many questions as possible. So getting to the panelists today, today's panelists include Shirley Bloomfield, who is the Chief Executive Officer for NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, the premier association representing nearly 850 independent telecommunication companies that are leading innovation in rural and small town America. With over 30 years of experience representing the country's smallest telecom operators, Bloomfield is an expert on the role of federal communication policies in sustaining the vitality of rural and remote communities and the benefits rural broadband networks bring to millions of American families, businesses, and the national economy. Next, we have Brett Kilborn, who is with the Utilities Technology Council. He is their General Counsel and Vice President for Policy. UTC represents vital energy and water utilities on their mission-critical technologies by driving innovation, fostering collaboration, and influencing public policy. In his role, Mr. Kilborn provides legal guidance to utilities on telecommunications issues, both pending in the federal and state agencies and being considered in Congress. He received his JD degree from Catholic University here in Washington, D.C., and his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of the South. Mr. Kilborn is licensed to practice law in the state of Maryland and is a member of the American Bar Association and the Federal Communications Bar Association. We have Mr. Former Commissioner Michael O'Reilly, who was nominated for a seat on the Federal Communications Commission by President Barack Obama on August 1st, 2013, and sworn into office November 4th, 2013. He served a second term through December 11, 2020. Prior to joining the agency, Commissioner O'Reilly served as a policy advisor in the office of the Senate Republican Whip, led by U.S. Senator John Cornyn. He worked with the Republican Whip's office since 2010 as an advisor and a deputy chief of staff and policy director for U.S. Senator John Kill. He previously worked for the Republican Policy Committee in the U.S. Senate and as a policy analyst for banking, technology, transportation, trade, and commerce issues, quite a bit. Prior to this, Commissioner O'Reilly worked in the office of U.S. Senator John Sununu, sorry, I missaid that name, as a senior legislative assistant from 2003 to 2007. He began his career as a legislative assistant to U.S. Congressman Tom Billy from 1994 to 1995. Commissioner O'Reilly received his BA from the University of Rochester. Finally, we have Jary Schwarz, who is Vice President of Global Public Policy at Comcast NBC Universal, where he focuses on broadband matters at the federal, state, and local levels. Previously, he held roles at the Federal Communications Commission, the Chairman's Office, the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the Office of Strategic Planning. Jay holds a PhD from University of Pittsburgh in economics, as well as degrees in civil engineering from Texas A&M University. So we have a packed agenda for today, and I'll start things off with a general question for each of the panelists, which is, what is one thing you hope puts in the infrastructure package relating to broadband. We'll start with Shirley.
Okay, the one thing that they put in there, thank you very much, Tom. Actually, I just want to go with hoping that they actually pass the legislation that they've all agreed to. But I think putting specific funding in there for broadband and really focusing on those Americans who are unserved would be setting our country on the right course.
Jay?
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to agree with Shirley. I think this is an opportunity here behind the backdrop of the pandemic, where basically the internet worked really well for the vast majority of the country. But we recognize there's some gaps. And since we're talking about infrastructure here, we have to acknowledge that there still is the access gap of unserved areas that are not yet connected. And so targeting funding to those areas is something that certainly makes sense. And we need to, I know we're going to talk about it today, but we need to make sure we do that in a way that is wise and a good use of the funds. Thank you.
Good shepherding of funds. Okay, great, thanks. Brett, your position or your comments?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I guess from a utility perspective, yeah, we're going to echo what Shirley and Jay just said in terms of broadband. I would add that, as they're looking at funding, they should be considering funding for middle mile as well as last mile networks. But then one more thing to put my utility hat on. I think that it would be good if they're looking at funding not only broadband infrastructure, but also energy infrastructure as well. As we'll explain later, the two go hand in hand. Thanks.
Great. And Michael.
Well, thanks for having me and BPC for running this. I would agree with Shirley and Jay and all the panelists so far. I guess it gets down to the details, right? What is an unserved area? And I would say we should be looking at the 25.3, those who don't have service today. And part of that answer is also that we reject a lot of the other policy ideas people put out there. Things like symmetrical speeds and artificial speed limitations and government-owned networks and mandatory low-income tiers. Those things should be put in the receptacle right here if you want. And that would be a sound direction. I think we've already settled. I think Congress has already settled pretty much around the figure, how much money they're going to spend. And now is how do we best spend it? How is it thoughtfully spent going forward?
Can I jump in and make a comment related to that? So Mike was just talking about how the numbers seem to be roughly set. And so knowing that, we need to make sure we actually get the job done here. There was I read a blog post recently that was actually talking about New Street Research's analyst who tried to size how much would it cost to get the job done and close the unserved gap. New Street estimated a subsidy needed in the range of 35 billion to 75 billion. And I think if we actually target it to the unserved areas, I think that's important to understand. So an independent analyst looking at the situation, and they're basically telling us that within the type of numbers that seem to be on the table, based on what we're hearing, this job can be done. But if we go on to these adventures that Mike was referring to there of trying to do other things, that's when we could really lose this opportunity.
So, pulling on that string a little bit and focusing it, we'll start with our first topic area, which is rural and urban broadband build-out access issues. So I'm actually going to throw it back to Mike with this question, which is, what steps do you believe Congress needs to take to improve rural and urban broadband access?
Well, look, I kind of explained where things I don't want them to do, things I hope that they will not do. I think they're going to actually come to conclusion on the funding overall. And it's really being mindful that how these programs fit together. How is this new program going to fit with programs that are at the FCC or NTIA or Department of Ag? How are they going to fit together so they don't counter each other and cause more problems than the worth? We really need to focus, in my opinion, and we talked about this, you really got to focus on those that don't have 25.3 now. Those are the ones that are struggling, have struggled during the pandemic, and really do matter. And though the programs at the FCC and elsewhere to help improve that, and they will improve that, but there is still going to be a population that need to be addressed. And the money that we're talking about, whether it's the $45 to $65 billion, which is 10 years of funding of FCC dollars, that's a huge amount of investment to be made. It's got to be made wisely.
So speaking of that investment in some of the where it needs to be invested in the most, well, Shirley, how is your organization focused on the issue of rural broadband access?
So just painting the picture, you'd mentioned I represent 850 community-based providers. They're cooperatives, they're locally held, they're family-owned companies across the country. They serve about 7% of the population, but cover about 35% of the landmass. So these are the folks who are really serving in some of these rural communities. But I will share one of the things that we've seen historically is, everybody wants to talk about a rural divide. I really see this through the prism of a rural divide. There is a rural American that is served by community-based providers who literally live, work, have their kids go to school in these communities. And then there's the rural America that is served by significantly larger carriers that are making decisions very wisely for their company based on where they can invest. And frankly, investing in a market that might have 5 subscribers per mile is not necessarily the best place to put the investment. So what we have really seen over the course of the last 15 years is a further division between who has connectivity, who does not, who has adequate broadband, however we choose to define that when that comes up for discussion, and who does not. And that is where we remain incredibly focused. And I think it is truly never more apparent than it's been over the past year and a half that broadband is not just nice to have, it is absolutely critical. The access that we have seen in terms of people being able to work from home, work remotely, school children learning from home, people doing this simultaneously, all of that has been absolutely critical, which is why broadband, has taken on even larger importance. So we focus very much on what it will take in terms of some of those very rural areas to actually get the job done. And, I think that while I would, look forward to discussing it further, I honestly think we have a once in a generation opportunity to really connect people who have not been connected. And are there a lot of those in rural America? Absolutely. I think every member of Congress goes home. And from what I've heard anecdotally, the first thing they hear from their constituents is, what are you going to do about getting me broadband out here? So we know it is very, very top of mind. And again, just the momentum around this and the recognition, which I think is significant, that broadband is infrastructure itself is very key. Now we need to get to work and do the hard stuff.
Very interesting that you mentioned that it's a rural divide, not just an urban rural divide. And along those same lines, I want to kick it over to Brett. Utilities have been stepping up a little bit to the plate here in terms of getting access to these areas. Can you tell me a little bit about what your organization has done?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. And I'll segue off of what Shirley just said. So UTC, we've been around since 1948. We're the only trade association for all types of electric utilities, as well as other critical infrastructure industries, but we only represent their telecom and IT interests. So hats off to former Commissioner Michael O'Reilly and also former Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who helped really establish a foothold for these electric utilities, who at the time were just modestly coming into the FCC to tell their story about how they were able to provide fiber to the home services in areas that were otherwise completely unserved. Extremely low density in terms of households per mile. Yet somehow they were managing to be able to do this. And by virtue of the leadership that we and the assistance that we got at the FCC, we were successful in getting the FCC to open up the Connect America Fund so that utilities could be able to first access rural broadband experience funding, but then moreover, be able to compete for access to the Connect America Fund phase 2 funding. And you saw that utilities were successful in getting about $260 million over 10 years in that phase 2 auction. From there, we've seen more and more utilities getting into this space. They were doing it primarily because nobody else would. And we're not only seeing the electric cooperatives getting into the retail space, along with the public power municipal utilities, but also now the investor-owned utilities are providing middle mile backhaul that they can provide to third-party ISPs into these unserved areas. So it's a really good story. At UTC, we're just happy to be part of it. And so we're trying to promote opportunities for further federal funding because, quite frankly, it is hard to provide service into those unserved areas without having those federal subsidy dollars. And so by virtue of having that funding, not only can we deploy into those areas, but we can actually do it faster, which is what we're all about. The reason the utilities are doing this primarily is just to promote economic opportunities into some of these areas that previously we're seeing population declines for the first time in this country's history. So we've seen dramatic benefits by virtue of what utilities are doing in terms of providing broadband infrastructure into some of these unserved areas. Thanks.
So, hitting a theme here in terms of funding, and this next question is for Jay. There's been estimates of tens of billions of dollars have been spent in the last decade attempting to get broadband to rural areas. And there's been mixed results there. Has the environment changed where we can expect to see this formula shift, or should other technologies be utilized to solve this issue?
Thanks, Tom. So in many ways, what really has happened here is we're at a time where there's significant amounts of money that are on the table with, I think, the goal of getting the job done. But actually the framework for how you can target these access gaps and close them is one that is, I think, a fundamentally sound framework that was laid out about a decade ago by the National Broadband Plan, the Obama FCC at the time, that said, we are going to define unserved areas based, in that case, on an eligible speed threshold, and we're going to make sure the money goes to those areas. That is still a fundamentally sound approach. And one of the other things that they focused on is they made sure that it was technology neutral. So focus on performance, focus on picking the appropriate performance speed, and then get the money to those areas and don't go off doing other things. An important stat, or a stat that I saw, Technology Policy Institute did a study and said one of the speed thresholds that obviously we're all hearing in the policy discussion is 100. So 100 megabits per second down, 100 megabits per second up. Anywhere that does not have that speed available from an ISP today would be treated as, potentially under some proposals that are out there, be treated as eligible for government funding to go to. Technology Policy Institute found out that about 58% of the country would be in that category of unserved. Now, I think that just stretches credibility. I think that it means places like Palm Beach, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas of our country, would be actually treated as unserved. And so what that would do is that would mean we have a limited pot of money. Those areas that tend to be more densely populated are going to be the type of areas that when you distribute that money, the money is attracted to those areas. And then places like West Virginia get left out because those are the harder areas to serve. So I think we have a fundamentally sound framework. We have, I think, larger amounts of money that are being discussed on the table. And so now we need to make sure that that money is, again, distributed in a way that works and that is, I think, a fundamentally sound approach.
Great. And this is a hot button topic. We've saved it to the last in terms of the speed question so that we can address it at the end there. But I want to shift gears a little bit, and that is broadband ownership models and government investments in municipal networks. So we've talked a little bit about the access issue and funding. Let's talk a little bit about the ownership models there. So I'll start off with Shirley. What types of broadband ownership models would be most feasible to bring to unserved and underserved communities?
So it's a great question, Tom. And I'd like to think that we've learned to be innovative, that we've learned to think a little bit outside of the box again over the past year and a half. So I think we need to do that in the technology front as well. You know, obviously I am partial to community-based providers because again, these are folks serving where they live. That really makes a difference. Partially because your customers are catching you at the grocery store or the post office if they don't like what you're doing. And when you're thinking about all of the really important auxiliary services, the telemedicine access, the remote learning access, you know, those are impacting the lives of potentially your kids, your family, all of that. But I do think, so I think local is really important. It doesn't, you shouldn't be based on a corporate structure, but I do think community-based has a real value here. But I also think, you know, as Brett was talking about, I think we've got to be cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of unserved areas. So once the FCC finishes their mapping, once we have a better sense of where those unserved folks are residing, where those communities are, to be thinking about who are the players who can come to the table. One of the things that we have seen over the course of the last few years that I just think is really exciting has been people partnering. I think the ability to partner and to say, you know what, maybe we can share create some scope and scale. Maybe we can share some of the risks by banding together. So for example, I have a number of not only telephone cooperatives, but even small commercial companies who are partnering with local electric utilities. And what they're doing is going into some of these areas that have not been served by some of the larger providers and literally bringing in service first time to some of these folks or creating a more robust network. I think that's really intriguing. It's thinking about, you know, what does each player bring to the table? You know, I'm a rural broadband provider. I know how to do broadband. I know how to run it. I know how to build it. I know what customer service looks like. And I might be an electric utility that says, you know what, I'm not so crazy about some of those tasks, but I've got access to poles or conduit or subscribers that are currently unserved. So I think thinking about how we motivate some of those partnerships, because what I find is it's really personality driven. If the two local leaders get along, we can find some way to move forward. If they can't, that doesn't truly work. So I do think that there are some different models we can look at. The one thing I will say when we talk about models though, as we talk about government resources, whether it's the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that is yet to really start coming out in terms of funding coming out the door, is we should also be making sure that those who come in for the funding are tried and true, that they have provided the service before, that they can actually commercially offer what they say they can offer when they are recipients of some of this funding. I think there is a litmus test that also needs to be applied so that we're not experimenting and we're not potentially dragging out the timeline of how long it's going to take for folks to get served. So for example, somebody comes in, has never done broadband before, never done it at the speeds for which they are awarded the money, and we go through a regulatory process and they get denied the funding. Those consumers are still going to be sitting there waiting for that service that they thought was coming down the pike. So again, I'm very bullish about all of that. And the last thing I will add to this is one of the things we've really focused on is how do you get the whole community around why broadband is important. That helps in terms of easements. It helps in terms of creating some of these partnerships. So we've been really working on creating smart rural communities in rural America. And that is not just the broadband and the robust broadband that the provider might be bringing, but what can that broadband do? What can it do in terms of precision ag? What can it do in terms of working with your local government and public safety and getting the community around and excited about the broadband possibilities, because there's also adoption issues. So again, we're really focused on building smart rural communities as another part of that model.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I imagine that Jay, you might have some perspectives you want to share here.
Sure. I think what I'd add is when we think about connecting unserved areas, we need to recognize that there's an entire constellation of different types of providers out there. And we should not, when we're distributing the funding, we don't need to be picking and choosing particular types of entities, subject to those entities being able to be technically, financially capable of performing. So we would say that you don't need to be putting a preference for a particular type of entity, because what you're trying to do whether it's through some sort of competitive bidding process, is distribute that money to the provider who can efficiently perform. And so I'd say that in terms of the types of preferences and just not having the government put a finger on the scale one way or the other. I would also, though, say that often there are unserved areas where, I'll speak about my company, there's been successful models, a lot of them at state funding sources, where they have been able to do partnerships with a locality to identify areas and work together with, in my case, Comcast, but they're doing it with lots of other private ISPs, where they're able to work together, identify the areas they want to reach, go access the funding.
Sure. Yeah, so we lost Jay, so we're just going to go ahead and head over to Brett real quick. In terms of municipal governments, how can municipal governments best invest in expanding broadband in their communities and making these investments?
You know, municipalities were starting to provide telecom service. And one of my first assignments at UTC was to watch the oral arguments in one of the cases involving preemption of these restrictions that were preventing some of the utilities, municipal utilities, from providing telecom. You know, fast forward to today, I would say we've come a long way. So, you know, a lot of these restrictions now are being, you know, turned back, and we're seeing that states are, you know, encouraging these municipal broadband providers to enter the market and provide service. And it's partly, and you're seeing this at the federal level too, in terms of these policies and preferences towards nonprofits, including municipal utilities and also electric cooperatives, when it comes to broadband funding, because those folks have managed to actually, you know, crack the code, and they're providing broadband that's affordable into some of these completely unserved areas. So yeah, I mean, our perspective on this is, you know, give those localities the opportunity to be able to provide broadband into those unserved areas, or even, you know, to deploy better, you know, networks and services into areas that are currently served. You know, that's what this country was built on. It's about, you know, the opportunity. And so, you know, we think that that's the direction that, you know, needs to be taken, especially in a post-COVID environment. You know, folks shouldn't have to wait any longer for broadband. I mean, and it also needs to be broadband that's affordable and capable of supporting the types of applications that consumers need these days. You know, working from home has become a new reality. That wasn't the case a couple of years ago. And so, you know, it's important. And one of the things that we're looking at the federal level is legislation that would, you know, authorize the FCC to remove some of these barriers to restriction. And at the state level, you know, to pick up a point that Shirley touched on, not only are we seeing, you know, states rethinking their policies around municipal broadband, but also they're removing barriers such as pertaining to the use of existing easements and rights of way, so that utilities can be able to provide broadband either on a wholesale or a private basis, using their existing easements and rights of way without running into kind of legal problems. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic and to encourage those kind of investments by government-owned entities. I would say. And it's good for public interest. Thanks.
So Tom, can I just jump in here? Because I think as we
Please.
all talk about these different models, another thing to keep in mind, given how precious these federal dollars are, and even the state dollars that we're seeing starting to come out from the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act, is ensuring that coordination, right? So it's ensuring that we're not overbuilding federal dollars over federal dollars that have gone in there. How do we make the best, I think everybody's touched on it, how do we make the best use of these resources, whether it's significant or whether it's tailored down. But I think making sure that the FCC is able to communicate with USDA, who's communicating with NTIA, and adding that layer in with the 30 some states that have state broadband offices and are also distributing funding. So again, what we're not going to incentivize is creating pockets where folks are competing using federal funding to build a network, and then we still have unserved parts of the country. So it's just something else that we keep top of mind.
Well, along those same lines, Mike, I want to give you an opportunity to, from a federal perspective along these things, what are some of the advantages of public-private ownerships?
Well, look at these are public-private partnerships, right? This is the federal government inserting money, whether it's the existing programs or the new infrastructure dollars. That's where the government is coming in and saying the market is not able to serve a particular area, the consumers are not being served. Let's provide capital for building these networks, extending existing networks or building new ones. Where I run into some difficulty is some of the directions and how far that's taken. And I have to disagree with Brett and his point. These government-owned networks, we did let them in the FCC when I was there. We did allow them to participate and didn't have a problem. As Jay mentioned, we should have a technology-neutral approach. We should have also no preferences. And so when people talk about, oh, we want this new broadband infrastructure program to be thoughtful, but we just want to tilt it towards our direction. We want to make sure it tilts towards municipal ownership. And that's problematic from my viewpoint. We know that there are problems with municipal ownership. They exist. There are limitations for a reason. There are a number of states have imposed restrictions for reasons that because of past failures, and municipal ownerships have problems. They have disadvantages. They have advantages already in terms of the tax code, all of the easements, all of the rights of way, all of the poles and ducts and everything that they already control in many instances, and they don't tend to want to use them. And then they also like to cross-subsidize with their electric dollars to hide the actual figure. So there are a bunch of problems with municipal governments, and that shouldn't be the model. We certainly shouldn't give it a preference for where we should go in terms of how this money is to be spent. It should be spent, thoughtfully, not tilted towards any one provider and saying, oh, these are the model, these are the only ones that should receive the dollars. Shirley mentioned the point, the federal dollars not, competing with existing other programs that have federal dollars put them. I would argue, and this gets to our first point, that we ought to not put the new federal dollars to compete against the private sector. And that really gets to the speed question and who is eligible and where is eligible. You can make the maps and the numbers all you want, but we should not be having the federal government come in and saying we want to build a network or use money to build a network to compete against the private sector. And I think that's what I took from Brett's comments, that he'd be open to that. And I can't strongly disagree with that. We only have such a pot of money, and we have so many consumers who've been waiting so long for service. And the idea that we would use that to compete and be a competition test and let that be a new goal rather than focusing on those that are unserved is just, to me, the wrong direction for our nation.
Sure.
If I can jump in on a couple of those, yeah. So yeah, in terms of the point about failures, I mean, to be certain, there were some municipal deployments that did not succeed. But there are plenty of other success stories out there. And, I'll just cite to one that, in Chattanooga, they've got, a fiber to home deployment there. They've got over 100,000 subscribers. It's they're providing, now service packages of 10 gigabits per second. And they had a recent study come out that showed that there were, over the last 10 years, 2.69 billion in economic benefits that were developed by virtue of that network, just in the Chattanooga area alone. So yeah, there are plenty of good reasons and success stories for these type of networks to be deployed. And then in terms of the funding issue, I quite frankly was not trying to say that for or against whether federal funds should be used for municipal broadband, but I do want to at least provide the opportunity for those government-owned networks to be deployed. They shouldn't be restricted. And we've, like I said, we've seen a change in terms of policy, either, especially at the local and state level, but also in terms of this legislation where they're considering, trying to break down these barriers so that those entities will have a chance to be able to offer broadband or work in partnership with others, which is what's happening, quite frankly, in a lot of cases. We're agnostic in terms of the model, and there are plenty of models out there that have shown success, whether it's working in partnership with others using dark fiber or lit fiber, some, partnerships between public and private, some not. So yeah, I mean, as much as this seems like a, perfectly common sense notion, I'm kind of surprised that it's drawn this kind of reaction from folks that seem to try to want to squelch it. So that's my.
All right. So moving on to a similarly hot contested topic is the new standard for high-speed internet to meet the needs for a modern digital economy. And I'm going to jump back to Mike on this. What should be the definition of high-speed internet, and what existing concerns should we be aware of as we begin to think about defining potential new standard for high-speed internet?
Well, look, and I used to be a policymaker and now I'm not. So I want to be careful here. And that's something the policymakers have to decide for themselves. But I'm mindful of those that don't have service today under the current definition. 25.3 has stood the test of time because we were trying to figure out how do we get service to that population that doesn't have it and hasn't had it, and how do we make sure we get those served before we move on to the next thing. And when people talk about 100 or 100, Jay mentioned 100, those things all have negative consequences for that. They lock out other technologies. They basically say, all we want is fiber for this. And we just don't have the resources, and we're not going to have the time or the energy to have fiber to all of the 58% that Jay mentioned that may need it under 100 definition. That's not something that's doable in any circumstance. So I want to be mindful when they do, if anyone wants to adjust this, that it reflect the fact that downloads are always going to be more than upload speed. And that is the reality, and the speed should reflect that. It's, symmetrical speeds is really a crazy theory. It's fine for people to build that if they so want to. It's another, if we're going to invest in it, it's even worse if we're going to define who is eligible and what areas are eligible based on such a crazy notion. There are great technologies that provide service today or on the horizon. Things like satellite today bring service to those that don't have it. That's what should be our main concern. Those that don't have 25. How do we get service to them versus trying to build, pie in the sky, grandiose networks to everybody on the theory that they will eventually use it or eventually need it when we don't have the resources for that purpose.
So along those same lines, I'm going to kick it over to Sherry. A lot of this speed impact in rural areas is a significant factor. What are your thoughts on what the definition of high speed should be?
So I adore Mike. And this is one area where we're going to just agree to disagree. I think that given the focus right now, we have a once in a generational opportunity to make an investment that really makes sense. I think it is incredibly inefficient to build a bare minimum network right now to everybody and then have to come back and do it all over again in 3 to 5 years. We as Americans have an insatiable desire for bandwidth and watching that grow exponentially. So I would even point out that I think the FCC has its own checkered history on this topic at best. 2011, after the National Broadband Plan, the FCC decided that 4.1 broadband was going to be good enough for rural America for universal service support qualification in that program. Then even as they were launching that, they came back and they modified it to a 10.1 target in 2014. Then 2 years later, we were in there with a number of other providers and other groups talking about why 25.3 might be the most appropriate table stakes, if you were, on that. And we were turned down for that. So here we are in 2018, and the FCC decided that 25.3 was the right target number. So my point is, it's the definition of insanity. We're going over and over and over again, kind of because again, user needs and user demands just escalate. So when we look at this, I think again, you can look at this and say, okay, we have an infrastructure plan, you know, doing this piece by piece is really a patch plan. It's like filling in potholes instead of actually fixing a bridge. So I do think we've got a real opportunity to do it right the first time. I think, yeah, every tool in the toolbox, because this country is widely diverse. And I know that from having companies that serve in Alaska all the way to the tip of Florida. And there are just going to be areas where certain technologies work better, but I am very bullish about fiber. We believe very strongly that it is going to be the most efficient technology. I look at my companies and I don't think symmetrical speeds are crazy, because we've actually been watching what users are doing on their networks. And my companies across the country are reporting, you know, 40 to 80% increase in upload demands as again, folks are working from home. So I think that we've got an opportunity to do it right the first time. And in the long run, you know, the fewer truck rolls, the less maintenance on the network. So while your CapEx might be higher from the get-go, your OpEx on the back end is going to be lower. We know that. And then, you know, the only other thing I would say is that, you know, I look at states where you may say this is really difficult to do, but, you know, North Dakota has probably the highest percentage of fiber of any state in the country. It's a very rural area, obviously long lengths between the loops, but they've been able to do it, and not just do it, but it will set the course for, you know, as everybody wants to talk about, you know, 5G. Well, you can't do 5G without fiber. It's a fiber-fed product. So the ability to give consumers the mobility, in addition to, you know, the kind of reliable, robust connectivity, I think kind of go hand in hand. So we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I think we need to do it right. I think fiber is the right technology to be investing in.
That's great. And we're going to get to Jay in just a second. I just want to remind that any participants currently watching, you can submit any questions at BBC Live or using the YouTube live comment, as well as the Facebook live comment. But if you want to tweet us at BBC Live, we can try to get as many questions answered at the end as possible. But along the same lines, you know, Shirley, you mentioned fiber optics, and there's actually a number of different definitions of broadband out there. So I want to kick it over to Jay. When we talk about the definition of broadband, there's, you know, several that we could define it as. Can you break down what the actual options are for us?
Yeah, sure. And Tom, I'm going to maybe go a little bit weedy on a nuance here, but it's actually a really important nuance. And if viewers are 42 minutes into it, I'm sure they can handle it. So there's often a conflation, particularly in even the infrastructure bill discussion that we've been having here and in the broader conversation. There's often a conflation between the number, the speed, the broadband speed you use to define eligible areas, and then what sort of speeds the networks that are funded will build, okay? And often what happens is when folks are talking about future-proof and planning for the future, they end up conflating that with how you define the areas that we really need to target. So just to give you an example, this is actually not, these numbers being different is not unusual. So in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auctions, the areas that were defined as unserved was 25.3. And I would say those still are the areas that we need to be targeting funding to. Very recently, Treasury came out with some guidance and regulation saying we should be targeting funding to build networks in the areas that don't even have 25.3. So that's the definition for eligible areas. That is not to say that those networks that are then funded should only be able to do 25.3. Going back to the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that's exactly what the FCC did, is they ended up funding networks that could do much, much better. In fact, gigabit speeds in 85% of the cases. And so when you're thinking and listening to these policy discussions, always ask someone when they're saying words like future-proof and so forth, what are you talking about? Because the fact is, areas that today have networks built to them, those ISPs have incentives to continue to deliver for their consumers and to upgrade those networks. We need to focus on areas that don't have anything or have truly outdated technologies that they need capital to upgrade those. Those will be your 25-3 areas. And then, yeah, it totally makes sense to make sure it's a scalable, upgradable technology, such as fiber, such as cable. There may be others. I'll leave that to other experts to figure out, to fund those networks. But those can actually be very different numbers. And I want to point that out, and you always should listen for that.
Great, thank you. And wrapping up this particular section is I'm going to kick it over to Brett. 22% of Americans in rural areas, 27% in tribal lands lack coverage from a 23.3 broadband standard, compared to 1.5 in Americans in urban areas. How can utility companies help increase the speed of broadband in rural areas without overbuilding in urban areas?
Yeah, so you started exactly the right point of departure, which is, yeah, as those numbers that you just quoted indicate the lack of broadband. There's studies out there from Broadband Now that indicate it's twice as bad as what some of these numbers indicate. So yeah, I mean, it's important, from the original question around speed, that we, to take Shirley's point, not, do the same thing over and over and over again, which is the definition of insanity. My only additional point to what Shirley would say is that we live in changed circumstances, right? The ground has changed underneath our feet. So the idea that 25.3 should remain the benchmark, I think, is fundamentally at odds with where we are right now. And the fact of the matter is, yeah, we're seeing when utilities offer broadband, we decided early on that it didn't make any sense to try and provide marginal broadband speeds only to have to up them later on. Some utilities had used other technologies. They had bad experiences with them. Better to make a one-time investment in something that would stand the test of time and be able to be upgraded without a huge forklift in terms of the cost of changing out the equipment. So in a lot of cases, fiber has been the technology of choice amongst utilities. Not that we're saying that that's the only technology choice, but certainly it seems to be the direction that folks have headed. And to the extent that folks, have used wireless, they're sort of migrating towards fiber too. So all that being said, I feel like, and I'm hearkening back to a conference I attended early in my days at UTC, where a debate was going on about what rural America actually wanted in terms of broadband. Do they want broadband at all? And the myth that was perpetrated during that meeting was that rural America didn't want broadband, or if they did, it was supposed to be something that was extremely marginal. What we're seeing in those areas where we've deployed, folks are not taking the lowest priced package. They are taking higher speed packages of 100 megabits per second or higher. And to Shirley's point about symmetrical speeds, yes, I believe that that is also the case. As more folks work from home, you're likely to see that upstream capabilities are going to be just as important as downstream capabilities. So, my final point in terms of harkening back to that conference was that somebody made the great reference to that old advertisement of tastes great, less filling. And this seems to be repeating itself over and over and over again. Instead of us getting mired into a debate about what the appropriate speeds for broadband should be, let's set a target, like let's go to the moon. Let's not focus on how we get there. Let's make the goal the objective rather than getting tied up in the specifics. So thanks.
Can I just jump in here, Tom? And just the symmetrical speed point, I think it's really troubling here. It's kind of conflated, to use Jay's word. It's not that I disagree that download speeds aren't increasing or that upload speeds aren't increasing, especially during the pandemic. It's the belief that they should be identical and symmetrical, and therefore should lead you to certain technologies that is mistaken. They may be increasing, and therefore maybe it's not 25.3 anymore, and we can have a fight over what the new numbers may be. But the idea that has to be 25-25 or 100-100, that is not accurate. And it actually matters tremendously when you get to Jay's point in terms of defining eligible areas for who's going to be, allowed to invest these dollars, these government dollars, to compete against who, is no longer considered broadband. That really matters. So the idea that it has to be identical is just actually mistaken in my mind.
Yeah, and hey, if I can jump in with one other thing. It's absolutely the case that recently and during the pandemic with video conferencing and so forth, we saw increases in uploads from a relatively small base. What Comcast has seen is that traffic still is extremely asymmetric. I would point you to it's a ComScope study. And I found this interesting and surprising. So 2020, it was about 14-1 downstream to upstream. But what I actually found surprising is that they looked at the pattern since 2010. And in 2010, the asymmetry was only 3-1. And it has steadily increased, and you can see it in their chart every year, up to 14-1. So it's not that it's not that upload won't continue to increase, but I think you have to have some pretty surprising assumptions to believe, to Mike's point, that it will someday be symmetric. Maybe it will. We would all be billionaires if we knew the technology that's going to make that happen. But I just want to point out that historically, it's actually on a trend to become more asymmetric. And yes, we need more upload as more download.
And I would also jump in and say, as we think about policy, we should be thinking about building the network for the future. We shouldn't be so close to, looking at what's right in front of us. We should be using these funds to build, again, the networks that we're going to need in 10 years and 15 years, maybe 20 years.
And one more point, just to tee off of something that Shirley mentioned earlier. Some of these applications on the internet that, are the future of the internet really, are just as much upload as they are download. So precision agriculture, for example, industrial Internet of Things. These are applications that by themselves are going to change the way that the internet traffic is viewed.
That's fair, but also recognize that both technologies you just mentioned have really small bandwidth and also can be done at multiple different times. And it's not like you're going to have upload speeds equal download speeds. I mean, that's the debate we're having right now, right? That there's going to be symmetrical and therefore you have to buy one particular technology. And it's just not true. It's one thing to say, well, we need more on the upload side. I would not disagree with that. But to argue that we should build only one technology, that to me is not actually matching up with the data that Jay brought forward or actually the experiences that consumers are having. In terms of using that definition and therefore those purchasing dollars for defining eligible areas, that's really problematic and just wipes away almost all the other technologies get wiped away, fixed wireless, all the interesting things happening with satellite and those satellite providers that are on soon to be entering the marketplace. These are really problematic decisions that I hope that legislators and policymakers will really take to heart when we go forward.
I'm going to jump in before we have the opportunity to keep going down this because it seems like it's a very meaty topic, and that's why we saved it to the end. But I also want to give some time to our participants who have asked questions and those who also are thinking about asking questions. We encourage you to do so at PBC Live. But the first question comes from, let's see, Chad Lafarge. I'm sorry if I misspelled your name. What is the cost difference between running fiber and running copper? And how does that compare to deploying the service over each? Anybody want to take that?
I'll go ahead and I'll jump in on that one. So there really is no price differential. Obviously there are times that copper is actually more expensive as a raw material. But when you are putting plant in the ground, you're putting plant in the ground. So your construction team is, probably part of your most significant cost. It doesn't matter what you're putting into plant in the ground because that is pretty much identical. The thing that I would say that does become the differentiator, which is why a technology like fiber is so efficient, is the fact that, again, you're able to grow as you need to grow. You're able to light up fibers as you need to expand. You are able, and what we see is just the troubleshooting, and when we're talking about a truck roll, here in Arlington, Virginia, you may be talking about 2 miles. In Oklahoma, you may be talking about 150. So, that is significant cost for these networks that need to not only be built, but also need to be maintained. So I would just jump in on that.
Another one is from Katie McAuliffe. Couldn't municipal governments raise awareness of programs that help low-income individuals connect to broadband rather than creating their own programs?
I'll jump in on that. We've been talking on this this conversation mostly about infrastructure, but Katie, it sounds like you're actually getting to the fact that the number of households who have a wire in front of their house and could subscribe but don't is actually much larger than the number who don't even have the opportunity to subscribe. And so you asked, could municipalities be part of addressing that? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. Folks may be familiar with Comcast's Internet Essential program, and one of the, while it does provide the opportunity for anyone to buy a internet connection if you're low income for less than $10, it also is coupled with working with community organizations and so forth, including localities, to try and help folks get connected. And we have found that to be an extremely effective strategy. I think it also gets to the fact that when we look at what's really underlying the reason for low subscription rates, particularly in low-income households, is that it's often things that fall into a category that's not just about affordability. So one statistic that I found really, really interesting recently is the Pew Research Center did their regular survey. They actually had one in February 2019 asking households under $30,000 whether they have broadband, and I think it was 56% said they did. Then fast forward 2 years to February 2021, so kind of well into the pandemic, hopefully on the way out of it. And it turns out that for those low-income families, the broadband adoption rate had only gone up 1%. Now, why is that surprising? It's surprising because this was during the pandemic when I think the issue of the need for broadband to school, to potentially work from home, to frankly just be stuck in your house all the time, the relevance to households was much higher than it's probably ever been. And at the same time, you had opportunities to purchase, if you're low income, to purchase or get broadband for free. And there's a number of opportunities. There's government funding there, making it affordable. Schools were paying to have broadband essentially be free to the student's household. And so in all that, we see very little budge in the adoption rate. So that goes to the fact that it's got to be something else. And one of the things that I think would be a great return on investment is if we went and figured out what are the ways to actually help those who want to subscribe but have issues not related to just handing them money as a subsidy would be. And so I think going back to Katie's question, certainly municipalities, that would, I think, be a much higher return effort to help get out the word than for instance, building a network in an area that already has one.
Yeah, I've been supportive of addressing the affordability issue, supported the Lifeline program and expanding it to broadband if we did some certain things. And I do believe that there's something to what Congress has done in the emergency broadband benefit program. I think there's a need to address that going forward and making it permanent. So I think there's value there, and plugging the municipal governments in and local officials on who may be in need of assistance on the cost side. Jay mentions another different factors that go into that, but on the cost side, I think there is a role that municipalities could play, just as they do on food subsidies and other government programs where they feed into those issues. And so I think there is a role that would be helpful, but it's not doing the other things that would be problematic in my mind.
And just one other point, we're in support of an all the above strategy, right? So the point I would make is it's not an either or proposition. If you want to try and subsidize the cost of affordable broadband, fine, but you shouldn't do that to the exclusion of municipal governments being able to offer broadband themselves if they choose to do so.
Great. And Shirley, did you have any points you want to make on this?
I would just throw in that, we talk about whether it's affordability, whether it's education, about what the internet actually needs. I mean, I can remember years ago when people would say, why do I need faster email? So that continued education on applications and the growing applications. I mean, for example, we run a group health plan, and the application used for Teladoc over the course of the last 16 months, rose by about 45%, not surprising. But the other thing that I think we need to think about addressing is access to equipment, right? It's the school kids that don't have a tablet or a laptop or, those devices. It's also affordability in terms of the end user equipment. So I think that needs to be part of the equation too.
Wonderful. It's almost as though we planned to do this on time. We are out of time. So I want to first off thank everybody on the panel today. It was very insightful. And thank you for taking your time to be with us today. I want to thank the folks that tuned in as well and your questions. Please look for other events as we put them out there. We will definitely be looking into broadband a little bit more. But I want to reiterate that we are very appreciative of all the panelists today and all the work that you guys have been doing to bridge the divide that exists in the United States around this issue. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great afternoon.